The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Judge Harold Pemberton's gavel froze mid-air. The woman he had been dismissing and ridiculing for the past hour stood calmly at the witness stand, her voice cutting through his incredulous laughter. "Your Honor, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Dr. Victoria Sterling said, her tone measured but carrying unmistakable authority. "I am Chief Federal Judge Victoria Sterling of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals." She reached into her briefcase and produced her judicial credentials, placing them on the witness stand with deliberate precision. "And I've been observing this courtroom as part of a federal review of judicial conduct in this district." The color drained from Judge Pemberton's face as bailiffs and court personnel began to recognize the implications. The woman he had mockingly called another activist with delusions of grandeur was one of the most powerful judicial figures in the region. "Now then," Victoria continued, her eyes never leaving Pemberton's shocked expression, "shall we discuss what constitutes proper judicial behavior, or would you prefer to continue with your creative interpretations of courtroom decorum? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." 3 weeks earlier, Dr. Victoria Sterling sat in her spacious chambers overlooking the federal courthouse plaza, reviewing disturbing reports that had been accumulating on her desk for months. As Chief Federal Judge of the Ninth Circuit, she had spent 15 years building a reputation for meticulous attention to judicial ethics and constitutional law. The morning light filtered through tall windows as she studied complaint after complaint from the Riverside County Superior Court system. Citizens reported dismissive treatment, biased rulings, and what appeared to be systematic discrimination in family court proceedings. The complaints shared troubling patterns: witnesses being interrupted, testimonies being discredited without proper consideration, and defendants from certain demographics receiving harsher treatment. Victoria's Chief of Staff, Marcus Chen, knocked softly before entering with a fresh stack of files. "More reports from Riverside County," he said, his expression grim. "This time it's from 3 different law firms and a civil rights organization." Victoria reviewed the newest complaints, her trained legal mind immediately identifying the concerning trends. "Marcus, I want you to compile a comprehensive analysis of all complaints involving Judge Harold Pemberton's courtroom over the past 2 years. Cross-reference them with demographic data and case outcomes." "Already started," Marcus replied, placing a preliminary report on her desk. "The statistical disparities are significant. African-American women, appearing as witnesses or plaintiffs in his courtroom, face interruption rates 340% higher than white male witnesses. Their testimony is discredited at twice the rate, and their credibility is questioned 67% more often." Victoria studied the data with growing concern. Her judicial philosophy had always centered on the principle that courtrooms must be sanctuaries of equal treatment under law. The numbers before her suggested something far different was occurring in Riverside County. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "Several attorneys have mentioned that Judge Pemberton seems particularly dismissive when educated black women present testimony. They describe a pattern of condescension and interruption that borders on judicial misconduct." Victoria closed the file and walked to her window, gazing down at the plaza where citizens from all walks of life sought justice daily. Her own journey to this position had been marked by similar dismissive treatment from colleagues who had underestimated her capabilities. But she had learned to turn those assumptions into strategic advantages. "I think it's time for an observation visit," she said finally. "Schedule me for some time off next week. I want to witness this personally." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're planning to observe incognito?" Victoria nodded. "Sometimes the only way to see the true nature of a courtroom is when the judge doesn't know he's being evaluated. I'll pose as a legal observer or interested citizen. Judge Pemberton has never met me personally. His interactions with federal court have been through intermediaries." "That could be risky," Marcus warned. If your identity is discovered prematurely, it could complicate any potential investigation. Victoria turned back to him with a slight smile. Marcus, I've been underestimated my entire career. I think I can handle one county court judge who's become too comfortable with his power. She spent the remainder of the week preparing for her undercover observation. Victoria researched Judge Pemberton's background, reviewed his recent cases, and studied the layout of the Riverside County Courthouse. She selected conservative business attire that would help her blend in among the court observers and legal professionals who frequented the building. The plan was simple. Observe Judge Pemberton's courtroom conduct during several proceedings, document any inappropriate behavior, and gather first-hand evidence of the discrimination patterns suggested by the complaints. If the reports proved accurate, she would have grounds for a formal judicial conduct investigation that could result in sanctions or removal. What Victoria didn't anticipate was how personally affected she would become by witnessing the systematic disrespect toward witnesses who looked like her, shared her background, and deserved the same judicial respect that she commanded in her own courtroom. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful judges were those who remembered what it felt like to be powerless. Monday morning arrived with typical courthouse bustle as Victoria Sterling entered the Riverside County Superior Court building, dressed in an understated navy suit and carrying a simple notepad. She had deliberately chosen attire that would make her appear as a legal observer or concerned citizen rather than the federal judicial authority she actually held. Judge Pemberton's courtroom was already filling with the day's participants when Victoria took a seat in the public gallery. She observed the judge's interactions with various court personnel, friendly banter with the bailiff, respectful exchanges with well-dressed attorneys, and casual conversations with court reporters. The morning's docket included several family court matters, civil disputes, and preliminary hearings. Victoria watched as Judge Pemberton handled cases involving white litigants with professional courtesy and appropriate judicial demeanor. His questions were respectful, his tone measured, and his rulings seemed to follow proper legal procedures. Then Maya Thompson was called to the witness stand. Maya was a 28-year-old social worker with a master's degree in child psychology, appearing as a key witness in a custody dispute involving an at-risk child she had been monitoring. Dressed professionally in a modest brown suit, she carried herself with quiet dignity as she approached the witness stand. The shift in Judge Pemberton's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. "State your name for the record," he said, his tone already carrying a hint of dismissiveness that hadn't been present with previous witnesses. "Maya Thompson. Your Honor, I'm a licensed social worker with the Department of Children and Family Services." Judge Pemberton replied, barely looking up from his papers. "And how long have you been doing this social work thing?" Victoria's pen paused over her notepad at the casual phrasing. Previous witnesses had been asked about their professional experience in respectful, formal language. The diminishing reference to Maya's career as this social work thing was both subtle and telling. Maya maintained her composure. "I've been a licensed social worker for 6 years, Your Honor, with specific training in child trauma and family dynamics. I've supervised over 200 cases involving at-risk children." Judge Pemberton finally looked up, his expression skeptical. 200 cases? That seems like an exaggeration. Are you sure you can keep track of that many children? The question was inappropriate on multiple levels. Victoria noted that male professionals who had testified earlier weren't questioned about their memory or professional competence in such dismissive terms. "Your Honor, I maintain detailed case files and work closely with supervisory staff to ensure proper oversight," Maya replied professionally. "I can provide documentation of my caseload if needed." "Oh, I'm sure you have lots of paperwork," Judge Pemberton said with a slight smirk. "But let's talk about the actual facts of this case. You claim the father has been neglectful, but isn't it true that you people tend to be overly suspicious of traditional family structures?" Victoria's grip tightened on her pen. The phrase, "you people," was an obvious red flag, loaded with implications about Maya's race rather than her professional qualifications. Maya's attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, that question is inappropriate and prejudicial." "Sustained," Judge Pemberton said dismissively. "But I think we need to establish whether this witness has personal biases that might affect her professional judgment." Victoria watched as the questioning continued to deteriorate. Judge Pemberton interrupted Maya repeatedly, questioned her education despite her advanced degree, and suggested that her concerns about child welfare were typical activist overreach rather than professional assessments based on evidence. When Maya attempted to present documented evidence of the father's concerning behavior, Judge Pemberton waved it away. "I don't need to see more paperwork. I can usually tell when someone's trying to break up a family based on personal feelings rather than facts." The pattern was clear and disturbing. Judge Pemberton was applying different standards to Maya's testimony than he had to previous witnesses. His questions implied incompetence and bias without any factual foundation, and his dismissive body language communicated disrespect to everyone in the courtroom. Victoria realized she was witnessing exactly the kind of systematic discrimination the complaints had described. But what transformed this from professional observation to personal experience was what happened next. During a brief recess, Victoria approached the court clerk with a question about public access to case files. Judge Pemberton, overhearing her educated speech and seeing her taking notes, called out from the bench, "Ma'am, are you some kind of activist observer? Because if you're here to cause trouble or make this into some kind of racial issue, you can leave now." Victoria turned slowly, meeting his gaze with calm professionalism. "Your Honor, I'm simply observing public court proceedings, which is my right as a citizen." Judge Pemberton's eyes narrowed. "You're right, huh? Let me guess. You're probably here to support that social worker and her exaggerated claims about child abuse. You people always stick together when it comes to attacking traditional families." The second use of "you people" confirmed what Victoria had suspected. Judge Pemberton was not just displaying poor judicial conduct. He was engaging in overt discrimination based on race and gender assumptions. Victoria remained calm, but she was no longer just observing misconduct. She had become its target. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Became increasingly inappropriate. Having identified Victoria as what he perceived to be a troublemaker, he began directing pointed comments toward the gallery whenever Maya testified. "Miss Thompson," Judge Pemberton said during cross-examination, "I notice you have some supporters in the gallery today. Are these people part of some kind of organized effort to influence my courtroom?" Maya's attorney objected immediately. "Your Honor, that question is completely irrelevant to Ms. Thompson's testimony about child welfare concerns." "Overruled," Pemberton snapped. "I think the court has a right to know if this witness is being coached or supported by activist groups with their own agendas." Victoria watched the systematic dismantling of Maya's credibility continue. Every piece of evidence Maya presented was questioned not on its merits, but through implications that she was biased, emotional, or part of some conspiracy to harm the family in question. When Maya described documented instances of the father leaving his 7-year-old daughter unsupervised for hours, Judge Pemberton interrupted. "Now, Miss Thompson, isn't it true that in your community children are often expected to be more independent? Maybe you're applying inappropriate cultural standards to this family." The racial undertones were unmistakable. Judge Pemberton was suggesting that Maya's professional training and legal standards were somehow influenced by racial characteristics rather than evidence-based child welfare protocols. Victoria's documentation became more detailed as she witnessed the systematic bias. Judge Pemberton's questions consistently implied that Maya was incompetent, emotional, and culturally biased. When Maya's supervisor, a white woman with identical qualifications, testified later that morning, she received respectful treatment and her conclusions were accepted without question. During the lunch recess, Victoria decided to test her observations by engaging with court personnel. She approached the bailiff, Derek Morrison, with general questions about court procedures. "First time observing Judge Pemberton's court?" Morrison asked with a knowing smirk. "Yes," Victoria replied. "He seems to run a very direct courtroom," Morrison chuckled. "The judge doesn't put up with nonsense. Some of these social workers come in here thinking they know better than parents about raising kids. Judge Pemberton keeps them in line. Victoria probed. "You know how it is," Morrison said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Some of these people see racism everywhere, try to break up good families based on their own issues. The judge has experience dealing with their type." The conversation revealed that Judge Pemberton's discriminatory behavior was not only known but actively supported by his staff. Victoria realized she was witnessing not an isolated incident, but an institutional culture of bias. When court resumed, the situation deteriorated further. Judge Pemberton noticed Victoria taking detailed notes and called attention to her from the bench. "Ma'am in the gallery," he said during Maya's testimony. "I hope you're not planning to take those notes to some newspaper to write a biased story about these proceedings." Victoria looked up calmly. "Your Honor, I'm simply exercising my right to observe public court proceedings." "Well, let me be clear," Judge Pemberton said, his voice carrying clear warning. "This courtroom operates on facts and law, not on activist narratives or racial grievances. If you're here to create problems, you'll be removed." The threat was both inappropriate and revealing. Judge Pemberton was essentially announcing his assumption that any criticism of his conduct would be racially motivated rather than legally founded. Maya's attorney requested a sidebar to address the judge's inappropriate comments toward the gallery observer. During the whispered conference, Victoria could see Judge Pemberton gesturing dismissively toward her. When the sidebar concluded, the attorney looked frustrated, and Maya appeared visibly shaken by whatever had been discussed privately. Judge Pemberton's final ruling was predictable. Despite documented evidence of neglect and Maya's professional recommendations, he awarded primary custody to the father, stating that overzealous social workers with personal agendas should not be allowed to interfere with parental rights. As the court session ended, Victoria overheard Judge Pemberton speaking to his bailiff about activist observers and troublemakers who think they can intimidate the court with their presence. They had provided Victoria with extensive first-hand evidence of systematic judicial misconduct. But more than that, it had shown her how discrimination operated when those in power believed they faced no oversight or accountability. Judge Pemberton had no idea that his behavior was being documented by someone with the authority to hold him accountable. His confidence in his untouchable position had led him to display exactly the kind of bias that federal judicial oversight was designed to prevent. Victoria left the courthouse that day with a clear understanding that formal intervention would be necessary. The question was no longer whether Judge Pemberton was engaging in discriminatory conduct, but how to address it in a way that would create lasting institutional change rather than just individual punishment. She had entered the courthouse as an observer. She was leaving as a witness to systematic injustice that demanded her immediate professional attention. That evening, Victoria Sterling sat in her home office, transcribing her detailed observations from Judge Pemberton's courtroom into a formal report. Her Victorian-era house in the hills overlooked the city lights, a reminder of how far she had traveled from her own encounters with judicial bias early in her career. Marcus Chen arrived at 8 o'clock with additional research files and Chinese takeout, knowing Victoria would have forgotten to eat while processing the day's disturbing events. "How bad was it?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from her mahogany desk. Victoria looked up from her laptop, her expression grim. "Worse than the complaints suggested." Judge Pemberton isn't just showing bias. He's creating a hostile environment that systematically undermines the credibility of black women witnesses, while his staff enables the behavior. She handed Marcus her preliminary notes. His expression darkened as he read her detailed account of the day's proceedings. "This goes beyond judicial misconduct," Marcus said. "This is a civil rights violation occurring under color of law. The federal courts have jurisdiction to address systematic denial of equal protection." Victoria nodded. "But we need more than one day's observation. Judge Pemberton clearly believes he's untouchable in his own courtroom. I need to document a pattern of behavior that demonstrates this isn't an isolated incident." Marcus leaned forward. "Victoria, you're talking about extended undercover observation. The risks are significant. If Judge Pemberton discovers your identity prematurely, he could claim the investigation was biased or improper. The greater risk is allowing this behavior to continue," Victoria replied. "Maya Thompson was just one witness. How many others have been dismissed, discredited, or traumatized by this judge's systematic bias?" She pulled up federal court statistics on her computer. "Marcus, look at the appeal rates from Judge Pemberton's courtroom. Cases involving black women litigants or witnesses are appealed at 3 times the normal rate, and the reversal rate is 67% higher than district average." Marcus whistled softly. "Those numbers suggest systematic error at best, intentional discrimination at worst." "Exactly. But appellate courts typically defer to trial court credibility determinations unless there's clear evidence of abuse of discretion. We need documentation of the judge's actual conduct, not just statistical analysis of his rulings." Victoria began outlining her investigation strategy. She would return to Judge Pemberton's courtroom several more times, documenting his treatment of different witnesses and litigants. She would also coordinate with the federal court administration to review complaint patterns and identify other potential witnesses to judicial misconduct. "There's something else," Victoria said, pulling up her secure email. "I've been corresponding with District Judge Robert Chen in Los Angeles. He's received similar complaints about other judges in this circuit. We may be looking at a broader institutional problem." Marcus raised an eyebrow at the name. "Any relation?" "My nephew," Victoria smiled briefly. "Robert has been tracking concerning patterns in several county court systems. Discriminatory treatment seems to be more common in jurisdictions with limited oversight and strong local political connections." She showed Marcus a confidential federal judicial database that tracked complaint patterns across different courts. Judge Pemberton's name appeared frequently in citizen complaints, but most had been dismissed during local administrative review processes. "The local Judicial Conduct Committee has been ineffective," Victoria explained. "They're reviewing Judge Pemberton's colleagues and political allies. Complaints get buried in administrative procedures that favor the status quo." Marcus studied the data. "So federal intervention is the only way to create real accountability." "Precisely. But federal judicial conduct investigations require substantial evidence of systematic constitutional violations. I need to document not just bias, but a pattern of conduct that denies citizens their constitutional right to fair judicial proceedings." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Maya Thompson had somehow obtained her contact information and was requesting a private meeting to discuss what she had observed in court. "This could be an opportunity," Victoria told Marcus. "Maya may have additional information about Judge Pemberton's conduct pattern. She might also be willing to provide testimony for a formal investigation." Marcus looked concerned. "Meeting with a witness could compromise your undercover observations. If Maya mentions your interest in the judge's conduct, it could get back to Pemberton." Victoria considered this carefully. "Then I'll need to be strategic about timing. I'll continue my observations for another week, document the pattern thoroughly, then meet with Maya and other potential witnesses." She stood and walked to her window, gazing out at the federal courthouse, illuminated in the distance. "Marcus, I've spent my entire career working to ensure that courtrooms are places where justice is administered fairly regardless of who walks through the doors. What I witnessed today was the antithesis of everything our judicial system is supposed to represent. Marcus joined her at the window. Your position as chief federal judge gives you unique authority to address this situation. But it also makes you a target if Judge Pemberton's political connections extend to federal oversight committees. Victoria turned to face him. Then we do this by the book. Thorough documentation, proper federal procedures, and sufficient evidence that no reasonable person could dismiss the findings as biased or politically motivated. She returned to her desk and began drafting a confidential memo to the Federal Judicial Council, outlining her preliminary findings and requesting authorization for a formal investigation. The wheels of federal justice moved slowly, but they moved with tremendous power when properly motivated. Judge Pemberton had spent years operating with impunity in his local kingdom. He was about to discover that his kingdom existed within a much larger empire, governed by principles he had forgotten and overseen by authorities he had never imagined could touch his comfortable world of unchecked power. Over the following week, Victoria Sterling methodically documented Judge Pemberton's conduct across multiple court sessions. Her observations revealed a disturbing consistency. Black women witnesses were interrupted 67% more frequently, their credentials questioned more thoroughly, and their testimony characterized with dismissive language that was never applied to white male witnesses with equivalent qualifications. Each evening, Victoria compiled detailed reports that would meet federal evidentiary standards. She documented specific instances of discriminatory language, inappropriate questions, and differential treatment that violated established judicial conduct standards. Her legal training allowed her to identify constitutional violations that local oversight committees had apparently missed or ignored. On Wednesday, Victoria observed Judge Pemberton handle a domestic violence case where the victim, an African-American nurse named Patricia Williams, was seeking a restraining order against her ex-husband. Judge Pemberton's treatment of Patricia was immediately recognizable as part of his established pattern. "Mrs. Williams," Judge Pemberton began, his tone already skeptical, "these domestic violence claims are very serious. I hope you understand that false accusations can destroy a man's reputation and career." Patricia's attorney objected to the implication, but Judge Pemberton continued. "Now, Mrs. Williams, your ex-husband is a respected businessman in this community. Are you sure these incidents weren't just normal disagreements that got out of hand?" Victoria watched as Judge Pemberton systematically minimized documented evidence of abuse, questioned Patricia's motives, and suggested she was exaggerating isolated incidents for personal gain. When Patricia's ex-husband testified, he received respectful treatment and his denials were accepted without the aggressive questioning Patricia had faced. The restraining order was denied despite clear evidence of threatening behavior and documented police reports. After court, Victoria discreetly followed Patricia to the parking lot and identified herself as a federal observer investigating judicial conduct. Patricia's relief at finding someone in authority who took her concerns seriously was palpable. "Judge Pemberton made me feel like I was the one on trial," Patricia said. "He treated my ex-husband like a victim and made me sound like a vindictive liar. I have medical records, police reports, and witness statements, but nothing seemed to matter." Patricia agreed to provide testimony for Victoria's investigation and revealed that several other women had shared similar experiences with Judge Pemberton's court. "There's a whole network of us who've been dismissed, humiliated, or ignored by that judge," she explained. "We started meeting informally to support each other because the official complaint process goes nowhere." Victoria realized she had uncovered not just individual instances of bias, but a systematic pattern affecting dozens of women over several years. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen had been conducting background research on Judge Pemberton's political connections and career trajectory. His findings revealed concerning patterns of protection and advancement despite multiple complaints. "Victoria, you need to see this," Marcus said during their Friday evening briefing. He spread documents across her dining room table, showing Judge Pemberton's relationship with District Attorney Robert Kingsley and Chief Judge Patricia Hawthorne. All three belong to the Riverside County Legal Society, an exclusive organization that's been instrumental in judicial appointments for the past decade, Marcus explained. Complaints against Judge Pemberton have consistently been reviewed by committees that include his close political allies. The documentation showed that Judge Pemberton had received multiple complaints over 5 years, but administrative reviews had consistently found insufficient evidence or characterized witness concerns as misunderstandings rather than misconduct. "It's a closed system," Victoria observed. "Local oversight is compromised by personal and political relationships that prioritize protecting the institution over addressing legitimate concerns." Marcus nodded. "But there's more. Judge Pemberton's campaign contributions show substantial support from the Millbrook Community Foundation, which represents some of the wealthiest families in the county. These are people who benefit from keeping certain populations out of their neighborhoods and away from their social circles." Victoria studied the financial records. So Judge Pemberton's discriminatory conduct isn't just personal bias. It serves the interests of his political and financial supporters, who prefer a judicial system that protects their privileges. Exactly. And those same supporters have connections to state legislative committees that oversee judicial budgets and appointments. Judge Pemberton feels protected because he is protected, at least at the local level. Victoria's phone rang with a call from District Judge Robert Chen in Los Angeles. Her nephew's timing was fortuitous. "Aunt Victoria, I've been analyzing the complaint data you requested," Robert said. "The patterns extend beyond Judge Pemberton. We're seeing similar conduct from judges in 3 other counties, all with similar political and financial backing." This revelation transformed Victoria's investigation from addressing individual misconduct to exposing systematic institutional discrimination. The scope required federal intervention with sufficient authority to override local political protection. "Robert, I need you to coordinate with the Civil Rights Division at Justice," Victoria said. "We're looking at potential systematic deprivation of constitutional rights under color of state law. This goes beyond judicial conduct to federal civil rights enforcement." By Sunday evening, Victoria had compiled a comprehensive investigative report documenting Judge Pemberton's systematic discrimination, the institutional failures that had enabled his conduct, and the broader pattern of judicial bias affecting multiple jurisdictions. Her evidence package included detailed observations, witness statements, statistical analysis, and documentation of the political networks that had protected discriminatory judges from accountability. The investigation had evolved from personal outrage to professional obligation. Victoria was no longer just documenting misconduct. She was building a federal case that could transform judicial accountability throughout the circuit. Judge Pemberton's comfortable world of unchallenged authority was about to collide with the full power of federal judicial oversight, guided by someone who understood both the law and the experience of being its target. The following Monday morning, Judge Harold Pemberton arrived at his courthouse in particularly good spirits. Over the weekend, he had received reassuring phone calls from Chief Judge Patricia Hawthorne and District Attorney Robert Kingsley, both of whom had heard rumors about a federal observer in his courtroom. "Harold, don't worry about some activist taking notes," Chief Judge Hawthorne had told him during their golf club conversation. "These people show up periodically trying to find problems where none exist. Just continue running your courtroom professionally and let us handle any complaints that might surface." District Attorney Kingsley had been even more dismissive. "We've weathered these federal oversight campaigns before. They investigate for a few months, write a report, and nothing changes. Your judicial record speaks for itself. Tough on crime, protective of families, supportive of community values. Armed with this reassurance, Judge Pemberton felt confident that his position was secure. His political connections, judicial tenure, and community support provided multiple layers of protection against outside criticism. That confidence was evident when he noticed Victoria Sterling back in his courtroom gallery, notepad in hand, observing the morning's proceedings. Rather than showing concern about federal oversight, Judge Pemberton decided to assert his authority more directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced from the bench during a brief recess, "I want everyone to know that this courtroom operates according to established legal procedures and community standards. We don't allow outside agitators to intimidate witnesses or influence proceedings through their presence." His pointed glance toward Victoria made clear who he considered an outside agitator. Several attorneys and court personnel nodded approvingly, sharing Judge Pemberton's view that external oversight was unwelcome interference in local judicial affairs. During lunch, Judge Pemberton met with Bailiff Morrison stepped forward, but before he could reach Victoria, she stood slowly and spoke with quiet authority that somehow carried throughout the entire courtroom. "Your Honor, before your bailiff takes any action that might constitute interference with a federal judicial investigation, I believe proper introductions are in order." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew her federal judicial credentials, holding them so that everyone in the courtroom could see the official seal of the United States Court of Appeals. "I am Chief Federal Judge Victoria Sterling of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I have been conducting an authorized observation of judicial conduct in this district for the past 2 weeks. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Bailiff Morrison froze mid-step, his hand still extended toward Victoria. Judge Pemberton's mouth fell open as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger, "your repeated attempts to restrict lawful federal oversight, your inappropriate comments about activist observers, and your systematic discriminatory treatment of witnesses based on race and gender constitute serious violations of federal judicial conduct standards." She placed her credentials on the court reporter's desk, ensuring they would become part of the official record. "This courtroom has been under federal observation pursuant to multiple civil rights complaints, and your conduct over the past 2 weeks has provided substantial evidence supporting those complaints." Judge Pemberton's face had gone from red to ashen white. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Chief Judge Sterling, there must be some misunderstanding." "Oh, there's no misunderstanding, Your Honor," Victoria replied, using his title with unmistakable irony. "I have documented your systematic interruption of black women witnesses at rates 340% higher than white male witnesses. I've recorded your use of racially coded language like "you people" when addressing African American litigants. I have observed your consistent pattern of questioning the competence and credibility of educated black women while accepting testimony from white witnesses without similar scrutiny." She opened her notepad and began reading specific examples. "Yesterday, you told Patricia Williams that domestic violence claims destroy men's reputations before hearing her evidence. Last week, you suggested Maya Thompson was applying inappropriate cultural standards based on her community rather than professional training. Today, you ordered me to cease documenting judicial proceedings because you perceived my presence as intimidation tactics." The courtroom gallery, filled with attorneys, litigants, and court personnel, listened in stunned silence as Victoria methodically dismantled Judge Pemberton's career with precise legal documentation. "Chief Judge Sterling," Judge Pemberton stammered, "I assure you that any perceived irregularities were unintentional. My judicial conduct has always been guided by law and precedent, not by any personal bias." Victoria's expression remained professionally neutral, but her words cut through his protests like a scalpel. Your Honor, intention is irrelevant when the pattern of discrimination is this systematic and well documented. Federal law prohibits the denial of constitutional rights under color of state authority, regardless of the perpetrator's claimed intentions. She gestured toward the federal marshals, who had quietly positioned themselves near the courtroom exits. These marshals are here to ensure the integrity of ongoing federal proceedings. This courtroom is now subject to immediate federal oversight pending a comprehensive investigation by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Judge Pemberton's political confidence crumbled as he realized that his local connections and institutional protections were useless against federal judicial authority. The woman he had dismissed as an activist observer possessed power that superseded everything he had relied upon throughout his career. What? What happens now? He asked, his judicial arrogance replaced by genuine fear. Victoria's response was delivered with the calm professionalism that had characterized her entire judicial career. Now, Your Honor, you will complete today's docket under federal observation, treating every witness and litigant with the constitutional respect you have failed to provide. Following completion of today's proceedings, you will be relieved of judicial duties pending the outcome of a formal federal investigation. She turned to address the entire courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, these proceedings will continue under federal oversight to ensure that constitutional rights are protected and that justice is administered fairly to all parties, regardless of race, gender, or social status. The transformation was complete. Judge Pemberton, who had entered the morning confident in his untouchable authority, now sat behind his bench, stripped of practical power and facing the end of his judicial career. Victoria Sterling had revealed herself not just as a federal judge, but as an agent of constitutional justice, with the authority to dismantle systems of discrimination that had operated with impunity for far too long. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual activity at the Riverside County Courthouse. Federal marshals had arrived early to coordinate security for what courthouse staff assumed was a routine federal prisoner transport. Judge Pemberton, maintaining his confident stance against federal interference, decided this would be an opportune day to demonstrate his judicial authority even more forcefully. The morning's docket included a sentencing hearing for Marcus Webb, a young black man who had pleaded guilty to a non-violent drug offense. Victoria Sterling, maintaining her observer role, took her usual seat in the gallery as Judge Pemberton called the court to order. Before we proceed with today's sentencing, Judge Pemberton announced, I want to address the continued presence of certain observers who seem to believe they can influence this court's proceedings through intimidation tactics. He looked directly at Victoria. Ma'am, your persistent note-taking and obvious attempts to document what you perceive as judicial misconduct are becoming disruptive to these proceedings. Victoria remained silent, continuing to write in her notepad as Judge Pemberton's voice rose with authority. I'm ordering you to cease, taking notes immediately and to refrain from any behavior that might influence witnesses or parties. Appearing before this court, Victoria looked up calmly and spoke for the first time since her initial observation week. Your Honor, I believe you may be exceeding your authority in restricting lawful observation of public court proceedings. The challenge to his authority sent Judge Pemberton into the kind of judicial rage that had intimidated countless litigants and attorneys over the years. How dare you question my authority in my own courtroom? He shouted, his face flushing red. Bailiff Morrison, I want this activist observer removed immediately for contempt of court. Bailiff Morrison stepped forward, but before he could reach Victoria, she stood slowly and spoke with quiet authority that somehow carried throughout the entire courtroom. Your Honor, before your bailiff takes any action that might constitute interference with a federal judicial investigation, they believe proper introductions are in order. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew her federal judicial credentials, holding them so that everyone in the courtroom could see the official seal of the United States Court of Appeals. "I am Chief Federal Judge Victoria Sterling of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I have been conducting an authorized observation of judicial conduct in this district for the past 2 weeks." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Bailiff Morrison froze mid-step, his hand still extended toward Victoria. Judge Pemberton's mouth fell open as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger, "your repeated attempts to restrict lawful federal oversight, your inappropriate comments about activist observers, and your systematic discriminatory treatment of witnesses based on race and gender constitute serious violations of federal judicial conduct standards." She placed her credentials on the court reporter's desk, ensuring they would become part of the official record. "This courtroom has been under federal observation pursuant to multiple civil rights complaints, and your conduct over the past 2 weeks has provided substantial evidence supporting those complaints." Judge Pemberton's face had gone from red to ashen white. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Chief Judge Sterling, there must be some misunderstanding." "Oh, there's no misunderstanding, Your Honor," Victoria replied, using his title with unmistakable irony. "I have documented your systematic interruption of black women witnesses at rates 340% higher than white male witnesses. I've recorded your use of racially coded language like "you people" when addressing African American litigants. I have observed your consistent pattern of questioning the competence and credibility of educated black women while accepting testimony from white witnesses without similar scrutiny." She opened her notepad and began reading specific examples. "Yesterday, you told Patricia Williams that domestic violence claims destroy men's reputations before hearing her evidence. Last week, you suggested Maya Thompson was applying inappropriate cultural standards based on her community rather than professional training. Today, you ordered me to cease documenting judicial proceedings because you perceive my presence as intimidation tactics." The courtroom gallery, filled with attorneys, litigants, and court personnel, listened in stunned silence as Victoria methodically dismantled Judge Pemberton's career with precise legal documentation. "Chief Judge Sterling," Judge Pemberton stammered, "I assure you that any perceived irregularities were unintentional. My judicial conduct has always been guided by law and precedent, not by any personal bias." Victoria's expression remained professionally neutral, but her words cut through his protests like a scalpel. "Your Honor, intention is irrelevant when the pattern of discrimination is this systematic and well documented. Federal law prohibits the denial of constitutional rights under color of state authority, regardless of the perpetrator's claimed intentions." She gestured toward the federal marshals who had quietly positioned themselves near the courtroom exits. "These marshals are here to ensure the integrity of ongoing federal proceedings. This courtroom is now subject to immediate federal oversight pending a comprehensive investigation by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice." Judge Pemberton's political confidence crumbled as he realized that his local connections and institutional protections were useless against federal judicial authority. The woman he had dismissed as an activist observer possessed power that superseded everything he had relied upon throughout his career. What happens now?" he asked, his judicial arrogance replaced by genuine fear. Victoria's response was delivered with the calm professionalism that had characterized her entire judicial career. "Now, Your Honor, you will complete today's docket under federal observation, treating every witness and litigant with the constitutional respect you have failed to provide. Following completion of today's proceedings, you will be relieved of judicial duties pending the outcome of a formal federal investigation." She turned to address the entire courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, these proceedings will continue under federal oversight to ensure that constitutional rights are protected and that justice is administered fairly to all parties regardless of race. gender, or social status. The transformation was complete. Judge Pemberton, who had entered the morning confident in his untouchable authority, now sat behind his bench, stripped of practical power and facing the end of his judicial career. Victoria Sterling had revealed herself not just as a federal judge, but as an agent of constitutional justice, with the authority to dismantle systems of discrimination that had operated with impunity for far too long. Within 48 hours of Victoria Sterling's revelation, the Riverside County judicial system underwent the most dramatic transformation in its history. Federal marshals had taken control of courthouse security, while Civil Rights Division, attorneys from the Department of Justice, established a temporary command center in the building's conference rooms. Judge Harold Pemberton had been immediately suspended pending investigation, his cases reassigned to visiting federal magistrates until permanent reforms could be implemented. The speed and thoroughness of the federal response sent shockwaves through the local legal and political establishment. Chief Judge Patricia Hawthorne found herself in an emergency meeting with federal investigators who presented extensive documentation of her role in dismissing complaints against Judge Pemberton. Her comfortable assumptions about political protection evaporated as she reviewed evidence showing her systematic failure to address discriminatory conduct. Chief Judge Hawthorne, federal investigator Sarah Martinez explained, "Your administrative reviews of Judge Pemberton's conduct appear to have ignored substantial evidence of civil rights violations. We have documented complaints dating back 5 years that were dismissed without proper investigation. The evidence included email exchanges between Hawthorne and Judge Pemberton discussing strategies for handling troublesome complainants and maintaining community standards in their courtrooms. The coded language revealed institutional support for discriminatory practices. District Attorney Robert Kingsley faced similar scrutiny when investigators discovered his office's role in supporting Judge Pemberton's sentencing disparities. Cases involving black defendants had received harsher recommendations from Kingsley's office when appearing before Judge Pemberton, suggesting coordination between prosecutor and judge to achieve discriminatory outcomes. Mr. Kingsley, Investigator Martinez continued in a separate interview, "Your office's sentencing recommendations show clear patterns of disparity based on defendant demographics. When these recommendations were made to Judge Pemberton's court, the disparities became even more pronounced." Victoria Sterling, meanwhile, had returned to her federal chambers where she coordinated the broader institutional response to the crisis. Her personal experience with Judge Pemberton's discrimination had provided the evidence needed to address systematic problems that extended far beyond one courtroom. Marcus Chen briefed her on the investigation's expanding scope. "Victoria, we've identified similar patterns in 3 other county court systems. The statistical evidence suggests this isn't isolated misconduct, but institutional discrimination that's been protected by local political networks." Victoria reviewed the comprehensive data analysis her team had compiled. "Marcus, the evidence shows that civil rights violations in these courts have been systematic, intentional, and coordinated. This requires federal intervention to ensure constitutional rights are protected." The Civil Rights Division had moved quickly to implement a consent decree requiring comprehensive reforms throughout the Riverside County court system. The decree mandated federal oversight, bias training for all judicial personnel, statistical monitoring of sentencing and ruling patterns, and establishment of an independent complaint review process. Most significantly, the decree included provisions for victim compensation and case reviews for potentially affected litigants from the past 5 years. Maya Thompson, the social worker whose testimony had first revealed Judge Pemberton's bias to Victoria, found herself contacted by federal investigators seeking her testimony for the formal proceedings against the former judge. Ms. Thompson, Investigator Martinez explained during their meeting, Your case was instrumental in documenting the pattern of discrimination. Would you be willing to testify in federal proceedings against Judge Pemberton? Maya's response was immediate. Absolutely. What he did to me wasn't just personal humiliation. It affected the safety of a child I was trying to protect. If my testimony can prevent other families from experiencing the same injustice, I'll do whatever is necessary. Patricia Williams, the domestic violence victim whose restraining order had been denied, also agreed to testify. Judge Pemberton made me feel like I was crazy for wanting protection from my abuser. His treatment of me was almost as traumatic as the abuse itself. The federal investigation had identified 47 women whose cases showed clear evidence of discriminatory treatment by Judge Pemberton. Many had been afraid to complain previously, believing that local authorities would dismiss their concerns or retaliate against them. Sandra Mitchell, the teacher whose custody rights had been reduced despite her ex-husband's violations, expressed relief at finally being heard. I thought I was imagining the bias because everyone kept telling me Judge Pemberton was fair and respected. Having federal authorities take our experiences seriously feels like vindication after years of being dismissed. Judge Pemberton himself faced multiple federal charges, including deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and obstruction of justice for his attempts to interfere with federal observation. His legal defense team struggled to address the overwhelming documentation of systematic discrimination. His attorney's arguments that the judge's conduct reflected cultural misunderstandings rather than intentional discrimination were undermined by recorded statements and documented patterns showing clear awareness of his bias and deliberate efforts to maintain discriminatory practices. The political ramifications extended beyond the courthouse. Senator James Patterson found himself under investigation for his attempts to influence federal oversight through political pressure. His phone calls to Judge Pemberton offering protection from federal overreach had been recorded and were now evidence of attempted obstruction of justice. The Millbrook Community Foundation, whose wealthy members had financially supported judges who maintained their preferred social order, faced federal scrutiny of their role in funding discriminatory judicial practices. Through campaign contributions and political influence, Victoria Sterling's methodical approach to documenting and addressing systematic discrimination had created a cascade of accountability that reached every level of the local power structure. Her personal experience with bias had been transformed into institutional change that would protect countless future victims. The investigation's success demonstrated that federal oversight could effectively address local discrimination when conducted. With sufficient authority, comprehensive evidence, and unwavering commitment to constitutional principles, Judge Pemberton's comfortable world of unchallenged authority had not just crumbled, it had been systematically dismantled and replaced with transparent, accountable institutions designed to ensure equal justice under law. 6 months after Victoria Sterling's revelation in Judge Pemberton's courtroom, the Riverside County judicial system had been fundamentally transformed. The federal consent decree created new institutions, procedures and oversight mechanisms that ensured discrimination could never again operate with impunity. The new courthouse featured a prominently displayed civil rights compliance center where citizens could file complaints with direct access to federal monitors. Digital displays showed real-time statistics on sentencing patterns and demographic data, creating unprecedented transparency in judicial decision-making. At the dedication ceremony, Victoria addressed a crowd that included Maya Thompson, Patricia Williams, and Sandra Mitchell, women whose courage had sparked reform. "This center represents more than federal oversight," she declared. "It represents the principle that constitutional rights belong to every citizen who enters these courtrooms, regardless of race, gender, or social status." Judge Harold Pemberton, had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. His conviction sent a clear message that discriminatory conduct would face serious consequences. Chief Judge Patricia Hawthorne and District Attorney Robert Kingsley resigned in disgrace after federal inquiries revealed their roles in shielding misconduct. Their replacements were chosen through reformed processes that included community input and civil rights reviews. Victoria's meticulous documentation became a national model. Federal investigators launched 3 additional probes in courts with similar patterns, sparking broad reforms across the circuit. The women who once stood as victims now shaped the system. Maya Thompson joined the Community Judicial Oversight Board, using her background in social work and personal experience to guide reform. Patricia Williams became a leading advocate for domestic violence survivors, her testimony inspiring mandatory training for judges statewide. Judge Pemberton made me feel like my safety didn't matter, Patricia reflected. Now victims know there are systems in place to ensure judges treat our experiences with the seriousness they deserve. Marcus Chen compiled a comprehensive report on Riverside's intervention, now required reading for judicial administrators nationwide. Discrimination often hides behind procedural legitimacy and local politics, he wrote. Federal oversight must be proactive, thorough, and sustained to create lasting change. The statistical outcomes were dramatic. Interruption rates for minority witnesses dropped by 78%. Sentencing disparities vanished, and surveys showed a surge in public confidence. More importantly, fear was replaced by trust. Citizens now believed their voices mattered in court. Dr. James Wellington, once the court reporter who risked his career documenting bias, now directed the courthouse's Transparency Initiative. The difference is remarkable, he observed. Judges and staff understand they're accountable not just to local politics, but to constitutional standards. Elena Torres, the journalist who broke the story, won a Pulitzer for her reporting. Her series illuminated how bias operated in hidden ways and how oversight could restore fairness. Victoria Sterling's courage in exposing this discrimination created an opportunity for institutional transformation. Torres wrote, "Law schools across the state introduced required courses on judicial conduct and civil rights compliance, using Riverside as a case study. What began as one woman's undercover observation had become an enduring educational model. For Victoria, the transformation was deeply personal. Her experience proved that justice required not only fair laws, but institutions capable of enforcing them equally." Reviewing progress reports, she reflected on how one judge's arrogance had exposed systemic failures that demanded comprehensive intervention. "Sometimes," she told Marcus during an evening briefing, "the most powerful response to injustice is to make sure it can never happen again. Individual accountability matters, but institutional reform protects future generations." The Riverside reforms demonstrated how oversight could address civil rights violations while preserving judicial independence. Pemberton's world of unchecked authority had been replaced by transparent, accountable systems serving all citizens equally, exactly as the Constitution intended, and exactly as Victoria Sterling's careful intervention had ensured. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.